Hi and welcome back. Today I'm going to be painting a semi-abstract city scene with a crowd of figures walking towards a shopping mall. I'm going to be painting it just in one colour, Payne's grey, and using a bit of white gouache at the end. My paper is Saunders Waterford cold pressed paper. It's a 1/4 imperial sheet and it's taped to my board with ordinary decorator's masking tape, and my board's at my usual angle of about 45 to 60 degrees. This is a small synthetic Polina Bright mop brush, and it's got a nice point, and I'm using it to start painting my figures. These are my foreground figures. I'll get those in so I've got some size and scale to work on as I put in some smaller figures. I started off when I learnt to paint figures following the tried and tested Frank Clark method of painting a sort of rough carrot shape that tapers down towards the ground and putting a little dot above it and maybe some more details just to give the impression of a figure. And I still do something very similar, except I've sort of found my own way of creating figures by shading in a sort of blocky shapes for the bodies, either with coats or jackets or maybe dresses, trousers, clothes, with sort of the silhouetted arms possibly out towards the side, and bags, that sort of thing. And I kind of carefully work, but loosely work on those sorts of shapes until I feel that the figure looks convincing. Like there, I felt that shoulder just needed pulling out a little bit, and a bit more dark on that head. I like to link some of my figures as well, as that helps them to look like they're conversing or walking together or in a large group. The landscape that I'm planning is a flat landscape, sort of maybe walking across a park towards the shopping centre. So all my figures will have their heads at a similar level, although their bodies will be shorter as they get further into the distance, which I'm trying to show here with these mid-ground figures. I've painted them slightly smaller, but because their heads are at the same level, that will give us a further impression that our landscape is flat. If you were painting a hill going upwards, then your figures would be positioned differently. The heads of distant figures would be higher up, and the opposite would be true if you were painting downhill. But for a flat landscape, obviously there's going to be some slight differentiation because of the height of your figures, but they'll all be more or less on the same level. This sort of thing can be very good practice. I've been a bit lazy with figures recently. I keep meaning to work out how to paint them using different colours for the clothing, etc., etc. But to be honest, at the moment, I really like painting figures in silhouette. They have that kind of almost sort of futuristic or film noir sort of look to them. I just find it a lot of fun to paint them like this, and I think it's a good exercise as well. It can help you to loosen up because it stops you from trying to paint a literal figure, trying to paint a head, arms, 2 legs, a suit, or maybe a dress and a coat, that sort of thing. What you're doing is painting shapes that work on the imagination of the viewer and they can see in those shapes that there's life, there's movement, there's bustle, there's things going on, but that you're not painting any particular detail within these people. And the details get even less the further away into the distance you go. Still similar level heads, joining the bodies together in places, just tiny dots for the heads to indicate just groups of people further away. Some of the figures have dried back quite light, so I'm going to black them in a bit more with some nice rich Payne's grey to get that nice sort of silhouette look. You could use any brush for this, whatever brush you're comfortable with, but I'd recommend one with quite a good point so that you can switch from sort of covering large areas of paint for the bodies to small areas for maybe small details like the shapes of the heads and things like that. Once my figures are right, then I'll paint in some shadows underneath them, and then I'll paint in a sort of background landscape with some maybe high-rise buildings and flats and the mall in the distance with maybe a few trees in the background too. So I think that's enough people on that side. I just want somebody in that gap. Maybe darken this couple up a bit more. I was going to use the rigger brush there for the shadows, but I think it'll be too thin, so I'll go back to my squirrel mop. And these shadows that kind of cross over some of the figures give extra depth and distance to the scene. This is my 1-inch flat brush. I'm going to use it to paint in the impressions of the distant buildings. I'm going to use very watery Payne's grey and just create these sort of blocky shapes to give the impression of distant buildings. This is a clean damp squirrel mop. This is a squirrel mop this time, not the synthetic that I used earlier, because I find that very useful for softening back and just creating a sort of misty, distant look so that we just see the buildings sort of through the mist in the distance. I think it adds to this kind of sort of fairly sort of romantic or sort of film noir look that's going on here with the silhouetted figures and the dark paint. Just keeping these shapes nice and geometric. I don't mind if there's uneven coloration or tones within the shapes. That will just give me more variation to the look of the distant buildings. Again, softening at the base, again, gives that either a misty look or it could possibly be distant trees. This is some slightly richer Payne's grey that I'm dropping into the wet paint, allowing it to diffuse and add even more like shadow and variety to the buildings, across the top mostly and round the edges. Just trying out different things and seeing how it looks. I've only sort of got a rough plan for this part of the painting, which is just to sort of get an impression of distant buildings. So I'll just work on this until it looks how I want it to look. This is the small Ron Ranson Pro Art Harky brush, and again using Payne's grey and the corner of the brush mostly, putting in these distant trees. And again, in keeping with what I've done with the buildings, softening out across the bottom so that I can blend that paint away to virtually nothing, so that, again, it just gives that impression of sort of misty distance. Just smoothing out some of those darker bits, didn't quite diffuse how I wanted it to look, bringing some horizontal sweeps across here and there as well. I'm going to add in a few more buildings across the front there. I think a long, low horizontal building would look nice. Just to sort of crisscross those shapes a little bit more, adds a slight amount of complexity. Maybe a pole or a post here and there too, like an aerial or something like that, lamppost. Adding some texture here and there with the flat brush. When the buildings are completely dry, I'll come back and put in a few sort of hints of windows and lights in the buildings. At the moment, though, I'm just building up this block of shapes. I don't want too much on this side, but I just want a few, just a building here, which I'm then going to soften back to balance things out just behind the trees in the distance. I think I just need a taller block and then a bit more sort of tone across that edge. I'm quite happy with that. I just want to add a few more posts and poles, like light lamp posts, that sort of thing. Something and nothing, just something to break up the blockiness of that background. Just these sort of random marks can often just add a bit more life and interest to the painting. I'm going to leave it to dry completely once I've finished putting in all the poles, and then I shall come back and put in a few windows, and I think that will do. I think I'll be finished, but I need my buildings to dry completely before I come back and put the windows in, otherwise they'll just smudge. So it's completely dry. I've got a very small flat brush, Payne's grey. I'm just dotting in some windows across this building and see how it looks. I'm not going to fill them all in because I think that would be too much. That's okay, but I think it's a bit too dark. I think I need to get a tissue, just dab it on there, soften them back a bit. That's right. I don't want the distant buildings to be too dark or too defined, but I do want a few of these windows, so I'll just keep going across the buildings here and there, dotting in these sort of enough windows just to give the impression of those buildings. Now this is my quite rich white gouache, so I've got some windows where it looks like either the light's catching the windows and glinting off the glass, or there are lights on shining through the gloom. I think that's just about enough, and I think that will do. So here's the finished painting. Let's take the tape off and have a look. I really enjoyed painting that. I find figure practice really fun, and it's great fun to make up these sort of very simple but quite effective urban landscapes. I hope you give it a try, because it's really good practice, and adding figures to your paintings can add an awful lot more to them if you can become confident enough with painting them loosely. I hope that was helpful. Thanks so much for watching. Please give us a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. And thank you so much to my lovely Patreon group who support this channel. I'll see you again soon. Bye.